I've interviewed some of you in the audience. I speak a lot every week on Marketplace Africa to people about these very issues. And again and again and again, I hear both governments sometimes, but mostly private sector, saying the one thing that is holding back Africa's growth is government regulations. When do you think a country like Ethiopia, for example, would liberalize the banking sector, the mobile sector?
Before I go to your question, I want to respond to some of the points that have been raised. Now, the World Bank says that there is over $90 billion. There's a gap of over $90 billion in investment in infrastructure. There has been very little infrastructure investment in most of Africa for the past 30 years. There was infrastructure investment in the initial period of colonization. And it's very interesting that you are refurbishing the railway system that was built by the Brits before the Prime Minister was born. And then in the initial years of independence. Since 1980s, the gap in infrastructure investment has gone in the wrong direction. Why? Because since the 1980s, the policy has been the private sector does the infrastructure. Now, why do we need infrastructure? What's the point? We need infrastructure primarily because that's an essential input for manufacturing, for exploiting our natural resources, for agriculture, and so on and so forth. Now, in manufacturing, public sector doesn't have much of a say. In agriculture, the public sector does not have much of a say. In mining, same thing. So enabling the private sector through public investment in infrastructure is not something that Africa is going to discover. If it tries to, it will simply be reinventing the wheel. That's what happened everywhere else. Second point I want to make. When I say much of infrastructure investment in Africa, not all, but much, will have to be public, that doesn't exclude, for example, in the case of a railway, implementation of the project will probably be done by some multinational company. The wagons and locomotives will naturally be manufactured by somebody else, another private sector. The management of the railway system itself might be done by a private company. But the ownership and the risk capital of that railway system, if it comes from the private sector, it will have a number of risks. First, all of you are saying the public sector has to de-risk. In other words, you are saying the public sector shoulders the risks and the private sector reaps the benefits. That's not going to work. Second, your discount rate is understandably high. You want to have a profit rate of what? 20%? The average profit rate in Africa that people expect is about 30%. With a discount rate of 30%. Imagine how much infrastructure we will be able to do and how much of the gap we are going to fill. So the idea should not be that the public sector should be out, private sector should be in. We have to do, each one of us have to do what our comparative advantage seems to suggest. Now, the public sector does not have money. And that is limiting investment in infrastructure. But you know, these whiz kids in the financial system, I'm sure they can create instruments. The Prime Minister created one instrument. It's called the IFF. The idea was that he would commit to pay a certain amount of money for, say, 30 years for development aid. And the banks would use that as collateral and give us the money now. Simple idea. Financial engineering. Same type of financial engineering can be made. GM has a big multinational financial institution. This talk about deleveraging and all the rest, there's trillions of dollars of money that does not know what to do. And because it does not know what to do, it's going from one commodity to another commodity and becoming a wrecking ball. Today it's oil, tomorrow it's wheat, the day after tomorrow it's some other paper. we want this capital here to do something tangible. And there's a risk here. And the risk, Don's institution is AAA rated. Mine is junk. So if Don could raise the money and lend it to me, then I'll have the money to invest. And the private sector can come in implementation, can come in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. Now, two issues you raised, telecommunications and finance. We have not liberalized the financial sector in the sense that we have not allowed foreign banks to operate in Ethiopia. Why? Because these giants, Chiam, manage an economy that's many times bigger than mine. These giants can wreck a giant economy such as that of the United Kingdom. Ours is a flimsy boat. They come in, they use instruments that we cannot control, that in most instances we don't even understand. The best of us don't even understand. How are we going to regulate it? How are we going to regulate these people? It's not possible. We don't have the capacity now. So what did we do? We allow the private sector in Ethiopia, which is not that, not infinitely more complex than the public sector, and therefore could easily be monitored and regulated by the public sector. We allow the private banks to operate here, so we have more than 10 private banks here, but not foreign banks. Is this going to be the permanent feature? No. As we grow, as we develop, and as we become more sophisticated in our regulatory capacity, of course we'll liberalize, but not now. And we have lost nothing because of this policy.
When we talk about infrastructure, it covers a very wide gamut of issues. When we talk about leapfrogging and the actual choice of what to invest in, there's a suggestion perhaps by Brian that we need to focus on industrialization, quick, fast industrialization, to the detriment perhaps of water sanitation. Is there a choice and is there a need to leapfrog some of the basic infrastructure necessities to kickstart this industrialization? And I ask you this because Ethiopia is trying to stimulate a manufacturing industry, isn't it?
Yeah. I'll repeat what I said earlier on. Why do we need infrastructure? It's for economic growth and transformation. Infrastructure that does not serve that purpose is meaningless. Now, let me repeat again, I'm not saying the private sector has no role in telecommunications. Owning a cellular phone franchise in Africa is like owning the mint. So why wouldn't the private sector engage there? I have no problem with that. It's possible. I'm not saying that the private sector should not be engaged in any infrastructure activities. I'm saying the infrastructure activities that matter for manufacturing is electricity. Roads, railways, ports. Without manufacturing, you do not transform our economy. So you can have all the best telecommunication in the world. If you can't manufacture a proper shirt to export, you can talk all you want on the phone, you will not transform your economy. So the key is agriculture and the key is manufacturing. On the issues that matter for manufacturing, for example, electricity, while the Nigerians have done a spectacular work on telecommunications, they have not done an equally spectacular job on power, electricity. And even if the private sector were to engage in generation of electricity, and it does, what will be the cost? They have to have their discount rate is steep. They have to have their profits. And who is going to pay for that? It's the manufacturing factory. So which one do I want to support more? The private sector that generates electricity or the private sector that uses the electricity? For me, supporting the private sector that uses the electricity is more important for transformation than allowing the private sector to generate electricity. And my good friends, Chairman Don, have said that we are impatient. Yes, we are impatient. We are impatient because we are in a deep hole. And every minute in that deep hole hurts. Not psychologically, physically, people die. People die of hunger. So we need to move fast. Now, with regards to the factors that have helped Africa move, governments have changed, there have been elections, policies, macro policies, and so on and so forth. That is all true, but to be honest, that's old stuff. It was done in the 80s and 90s. So there's nothing new here. We are maintaining the same thing. We still have our conflicts. We still have our problems in governance. We have moved more aggressively to come up with a common African agenda and to engage the international community with one voice, and that has been a very important factor. And there is this big change globally. The tremendous growth in Asia has been the biggest savior of Africa. And we shouldn't ignore that. Now, if we don't take care, we'll be taken for a ride and dropped when the time comes. If we don't use this window of opportunity to transform our economies, then we'll be lost. And we have to learn from the experience of others. Most of the successful Asian countries, most of the infrastructure investment was not done by the private sector. It was done by the public sector. So let us not dichotomize. Let us, each one of us, do what we are best able to do. I forgot your question, sorry.
I think heads of state are allowed to forget questions. Is that you're allowed?
You're getting old.
The problem is I also forgot my question. So, so we're equal, okay.